How fitting that our sister congregation from Sonoma County is visiting with us on this Shabbat. The name of Santa Rosa's Progressive Reform Synagogue, led by a longtime colleague and friend, Rabbi George Gittleman, is Shomrei Torah, which means guardians of Torah. They also have a Czech Holocaust Torah. It can also mean stewards of Torah. And in this week's Torah portion, Leviticus 25 into 26, Bahar, listen carefully to what the Torah says. I'll read it in English. Quote, "When you enter the land that I assign to you," the land, not you, the land, "shall observe a Sabbath of the eternal. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard, your winery, and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard." So we learn again this week the high priority the Torah places on social justice. That it's not only people who have rights, nature does too, because nature doesn't belong to us. Our lives really don't belong to us. It's all on loan to us. Our ancestors protected the land, and they went even further. They worked their own farm for 6 years, and during the 7th or sabbatical year, everyone was entitled to whatever grew on it. Everyone was entitled. Why? Because in a just society, everyone must have access to food, especially when it is scarce. The reason for food scarcity in Shelby County and in the United States is not due to a lack of food. It's due to food deserts in our poorest neighborhoods. But this is a religious message because the Torah holds, in the end, you are not the ultimate owner of your land or even your life. God is. So that covers every 7 years. But get ready for something even more radical that's proposed in this week's Torah reading. After 7 times 7 of these sabbatical years, even more radical, during the 50th or Jubilee year, you must return all land to its original owners and set free everyone who's become a slave. Now think about this. Agriculture was the biggest industry back then. So when droughts came and crops failed, the rich became richer, and the less fortunate people had to sell their land in order to eat. They became sharecroppers, or the poorest, our ancestors, even had to sell themselves into slavery in order to survive. But not for long, says the Torah. The Torah says no to this kind of injustice. Memphian author and lifelong temple family member Alan Lightman wrote a brilliant article in the New York Times this week directly related to what I'm talking about in this week's Torah portion. Just as this week's Torah portion calls attention to our relationship with nature, so does Alan, but not for theological reasons. He calls himself an atheist, and he writes, quote, "The tornadoes that have been devastating parts of the South and Midwest, just weeks after a deadly mudslide in Washington, demonstrate once again the unimaginable power of nature. After each disaster, we grieve over the human lives lost, the innocent people drowned or crushed without warning from a tornado as they slept in their beds, worked in their fields, or sat at their office desks. We feel angry at the scientists and policymakers who didn't foresee the impending calamity, or if forewarned, failed to protect us. Beyond the grieving and anger is a more subtle emotion. We feel betrayed. We feel betrayed by nature. Aren't we a part of nature? Born in nature, sustained by the food brought forth by nature, warmed by the natural sun? Don't we have a deep spiritual connection with the wind and the water and the land that Emerson and Wordsworth so lovingly described, that Turner painted in scenes of serenity and grandeur? How could Mother Nature do this to us, her children? Yet despite our strongly felt kinship and oneness with nature, Allen writes, all the evidence suggests that nature doesn't care one whit about us. Tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions happen without the slightest consideration for human inhabitants. So what he's suggesting is that our comfort with nature is an illusion. Here on earth, even with earthquakes and storms, we have no conception of the range and the power of nature. I learned from my dear friend Alan this week that in many other parts of the cosmos, conditions are so much more extreme than we realize and completely inhospitable to life. Listen to this. On the planet Mercury, the temperature exceeds 800 degrees. On Neptune, it is 370 below zero. On Uranus, the wind exceeds 350 miles per hour. And with the recent work of the Kepler spacecraft, searching for planets favorable for life, we can now estimate that only about 1 millionth of 1 billionth of 1% of the material of the visible universe exists in living form. So from a cosmic perspective, you and I, all life, are the exception to the rule. For all the beauty of nature, Allen's argument is that we've been fooling ourselves. Nature isn't our friend or our enemy. Nature simply is. It's purposeless. We may find nature beautiful, or if you're in Dallas yesterday, terrible, but those feelings that we have are human constructions. We feel such a strong connection to nature. But the relationship between nature and us is one-sided. There's no reciprocity. There's no mind on the other side of the wall. Allen says nature can survive far more than what we can do to it, and is totally oblivious to whether humans live or die in the next 100 years. What's the point? We should be concerned about protecting our planet, but not because of the planet. We should not be concerned about protecting our planet. Our concern should be about protecting ourselves, because we have only ourselves and this world to protect us. The headline this week on the research front, in case you missed it, is that climate change is no longer a distant threat. It's a real and present danger. Average temperatures in the United States have increased nearly 2 degrees in parts of our country, 2 degrees, since we began keeping records in 1895. And much of that warming has come in recent decades. 2001 to 12 was warmer than any previous decade on record across all regions of the country. And just one more stat before you glaze over this. The average time between the last spring frost and the first fall frost in the Southwest increased by 19 days since I moved here in 1991, compared with prior years. Now, full disclosure, I'm a central air guy. I am not an outdoorsman like Rabbi George. I am not an environmentalist like others of you. But whether you are a spiritual atheist like Alan Lightman or a religious believer like me, release and redemption are not just about people. Proclaim Ukratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha, proclaim liberty, freedom throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. The presumption is that the land will already be resting every 7 years. And if you've been listening, in year 49 and 50, 2 years of land rest. Why? Not because our ancestors were tree huggers, but because the Torah is warning us about the consequences of depleting and abusing the land in a natural world that really doesn't give a whit about us. Nature is random and amoral too. The tornado can care less about what house it hits. Ditto for the mudslide. Nature simply is. And in closing, one more point. Nature simply is means that goodness, morality, and ethics have nothing to do with nature. And maybe that is our distinguishing feature as humanity on this planet. Not the dim percentage of inhabitable space in the cosmos, but within this inhabitable space, the capacity for moral discernment vis-a-vis all the other creatures surrounding us. When animals rip each other to shreds in the wild kingdom, many animal enthusiasts say, it's their nature. We humans have the capacity to transcend that, or at least protect ourselves from the ferocity of nature. So whether you believe that ethics come from God, as I do, or that ethics, morality, and goodness originate within you, as an Alan Lightman does, we cannot look elsewhere for those qualities, which I suppose makes our Torah's emphasis all the more imperative, that we lead purposeful, thoughtful, and considered lives. Amen.